you. Center for Cross-Cultural Communication is just a fancy name for general semantics. But it was the predecessor for the museum, and it enabled me to put together a board of advisors, which included people like Margaret Mead and Joseph Campbell, Leslie White, and Ben Shahn, people from all the various social sciences and the arts. And that was the platform from which I was able to launch the Museum of African Art, which I then turned over after 15 years to the Smithsonian, relieving me of various responsibilities so I could come down here and participate in something like this evening. And it's a pleasure for me to do so because Robert Carneiro and I were classmates at the University of Michigan years and years ago, but we didn't really know each other. We lived in the same resident hall, and we were peripherally aware of each other's existence, but we didn't chum around together. I wish we had. But Carneiro was certainly a product of the University of Michigan at this time that Harvard is beginning to be called the Michigan of the East. I was testing that out because that's a standard joke in Ann Arbor, but I wanted to see what the response would be in New York City. In any case, Bob has degrees, BA, MA, and PhD in anthropology. Well, the first one was political science, but he soon learned better and ended up as a cultural anthropologist, in which capacity we know him and know him well, and he's known very well in this institution where we're speaking tonight. He's had a very broad academic career, which I won't recount. He's had many assignments, ethnological field trips and so forth overseas. He's written on a wide variety of subjects, the ones that you might expect from such a scholar, but even one on, where is it, on baseball. I can't find it here. I was going to just throw it in to my remarks. But anyway, he's written many, many monographs on a variety of subjects. And some of that will be reflected, I'm sure, in what he has to say this evening. When the call went out for recommendations for a speaker for this year's Korzybski lecture, I submitted his name with great pleasure, and now with great gratification that he was selected to be the speaker this evening. And I don't believe in people taking lots of time with introductions of speakers, so I'll give him all the time that he deserves and will be used very illuminatingly for us all, I'm sure.
Thank you very much, Warren. As far as I know, Leslie White never cited Korzybski in print, but the two had a very great interest in the same thing, namely words. Words, of course, are the ultimate symbol, and White wrote an article in 1939 entitled "The Symbol, the Origin and Basis of Human Behavior." And White was clear in his definition of a symbol. That's something in which meaning does not inhere, but is assigned to it arbitrarily by those who use it. Now, White saw the symbol, of course, as the way in which human beings were able to communicate and erect the structure that we know of as the state of civilization. So his view of words was essentially positive, constructive. Korzybski, on the other hand, looked often at the negative side of words, that pointing to the fact that people so often thought of words as things in themselves and didn't realize that they were symbols. And a lot of the mental difficulties that people get themselves into are the result of this failure to see a symbol for what it is. If you look in the back, in the index of Science and Sanity, you will not find the word evolution. But you will find the word or the term time binding. And in fact, here is what Korzybski had to say, how he defined it. He said, human beings differ from animals in the fact that each generation can start where the former generation left off. Now, translating this into anthropological terminology, time binding is what? Is accumulation. And anthropologists are tired of repeating culture is cumulative. And accumulation is simply the addition of the new along with the retention of the old. And this, of course, is one of the major features of evolution. That is, it consists of building larger and more complex structures by taking the elemental pieces of it and building them up, aggregating them. So, any aspect of evolution can then be seen as consisting very largely of this accumulation of things. And that, of course, is true of political evolution as well as evolution in other aspects of culture. Well, when I first went into the field among the Kwikuru in central Brazil in 1953, if there could be said to have been a theory of the origin of a state at all, it was what I call the automatic theory, that had been more or less proposed by Old World archaeologists like V. Gordon Childe and Leonard Woolley.
Excuse me, could you please raise your microphone closer to your mouth?
Okay, is that better?
Oh, yeah.
And according to this theory, when agriculture came upon the scene about 10,000 years ago, because it could produce a surplus of food, individuals were able to be divorced from primary food production and begin specializing in ceramics, in weaving, in metallurgy, in priesthood, and chiefs, and so on. And that somehow, automatically, the steps were not really spelled out. This gave rise to the state. Well, the group that I work with in Brazil, the Kwikuru, practiced slash and burn agriculture with manioc as its staple crop. And Kwikuru agriculture was more productive per unit of land or per unit of labor than the agriculture of the Inca. And whereas the Kwikuru were a simple village of about 145 people, completely autonomous politically, the Inca comprised this vast empire, some 10 million people over a very large area, with very complex culture, and with a system of agriculture that was less productive than that of the Kwikuru. So obviously, the automatic theory was wrong, or at least incomplete. Sure, agriculture was necessary for state to come on the scene, and until we had agriculture, it was impossible to expect a state to arise. But something more than that had to be involved. What was it? Well, one of the ingredients that I thought was at the base of the formation of states, out of beginning with simple autonomous units, autonomous villages, was warfare. In those days, anthropologists tended to look askance at warfare as playing any constructive role. It was all, after all, a nasty, unpalatable thing. And for instance, in those days, it was thought that the Maya had developed completely without warfare. And you frequently find statements about the peaceful Maya. This, of course, has since been disproved, first by the discovery of the Bonaparte murals in southern Mexico, but since then by a lot more epigraphic and other evidence of warfare. So warfare was involved, but warfare was prevalent in Amazonia. It was also prevalent in Peru. Now, what was the difference between the two areas? Was it something environmental? And here I thought we had something to work on. From the point of view of political development, the outstanding feature of Amazonia is that it consists of an area of extensive, unbounded agricultural land. That almost any part of the forest can be felled, and agricultural crops, especially manioc, grown very successfully. Now, that meant that when there was warfare between adjacent villages, the defeated villages need not stay in place and be subjugated by the victor, but it could flee to a safer location and start a village there just about as well as before. So it was population growth, of course, was occurring in both areas, slow and gradually, and it operated by a process of individual villages would grow in size to a certain point and then split, grow and split. So what we have is a proliferation of villages. But in Amazonia, they sort of spaced themselves out at arm's length because there was plenty of land and because the land was essentially unbroken. If we look at the coast of Peru, where Andean states first arose, what we see is something quite different. We have several dozen short rivers that come down from the Andes and flow into the Pacific. And these rivers flow through probably the world's driest desert. So what we had was river valleys with very fertile soil close to the river, and then sheer desert on either side. At the headwaters then we had the mountains, at the other end of the river the sea, and on either side desert. Now the villages, the agricultural villages that occurred there, that existed there autonomously from an early period, engaged in warfare just as Amazonian villages did, but the results were strikingly different. At first, as long as there was enough land, you had the process of fight and flight. But it wasn't long before these villages found themselves with no more room to expand in. And so defeated villages had to stay put and be subjugated by the victorious one. This meant that for the first time we get the creation of multi-village chieftains, the first supra-village form of political organization ever to occur in the world. Human culture goes back to perhaps 2 million years, and yet it wasn't until some maybe 5,000 years, 5,000 BC, that we get for the first time multi-village aggregates. Well, so then we get in these various valleys along the coast of Peru, first small chiefdoms emerging. They continue to grow. Population pressure on the land continues. But then the contention is no longer between autonomous villages, but between chieftains. And as the process is prolonged, we get the stronger chieftains defeating the weaker ones until eventually we get a valley-wide kingdom. Not in every valley, but some were larger than others, and some of them evolved further than others. But basically, small states were able to emerge when these chieftains had conquered each other in each valley. So the essential feature then was that these valleys were circumscribed environmentally. Now comparing Amazonia and Peru then, we had these very sharp environmental differences that seemed to make the difference between having just simple autonomous villages in Amazonia and chieftains or states along the coast of Peru. Okay, when you have a theory, the first thing you want to do is to test it against other cases of the ones that you based it on. So I looked further north, looking at Mexico, the Valley of Mexico, where we know the state emerged, with Teotihuacan as its capital. And sure enough, the Valley of Mexico is a nicely circumscribed area, a large sort of bowl with mountains all around it. If we look at Oaxaca, southern Mexico, we have the same thing, a very narrowly, sharply circumscribed valley where a state also emerged. Okay, so far so good. What about other parts of the world? Let's look at the old world. There was the Valley of the Nile, again, nicely circumscribed, sharp desert on either side of the Nile. Tigris Euphrates, much the same thing. The Indus Valley in northwest India, likewise, a river with desert on both sides. The Yellow River in China seemed at first to be an exception. But as I learned more about it later, I realized, no, here too we had circumscription, environmental circumscription. The Chinese state first arose in that area around the inverted T, where the Wei River flows eastward into the bend, the big bend of the Yellow River. Now, some of you who are Chinese scholars may say, well, the famous Shang civilization was located at the lower end of the Yellow River. And that's true, because the factors that are most conducive to the rise of the state initially aren't necessarily those that are best suited to its florescence. But the Chinese state emerged in that T of the Wei and the Yellow River, and then later on it flourished in the lower part of the Yellow River. All right, let's go a little bit farther afield to Polynesia. There's nothing more sharply circumscribed than an island. And we find, for example, in Tahiti and Hawaii, states, or something very close to states, had emerged. So the circumscription theory seemed to answer the call pretty well for explaining how states arose. But one always is looking for exceptions to rules, because the exceptions will perhaps suggest modifications, which will then cast a wider net and explain more cases. Going back to the New World, when you look at the Maya or the Olmec in Guatemala, southern Mexico, here were cases where, among the Maya, certainly states, even though relatively small, emerged. Among the Olmec, even the specialists themselves aren't sure whether they were big chiefdoms or small states. Anyway, they were both areas where political development had proceeded quite far. Yet there were areas that did not have environmental circumscription. Well, can we make some modification of the theory to encompass these cases? What do we have to add to the environmental circumscription theory to make it work here? And I think two factors would do the trick. One was resource concentration, and the other one, social circumscription. Resource concentration is the feature that food resources, especially food resources, are available in an area in much greater quantities than surrounding regions. So they attract population to these areas and help build up population density. And to give you good examples of this, let's take the Amazon River in South America and the Mississippi in North America. The Amazon particularly. The river is blessed with an abundance of many kinds of fish, an overabundance of fish. It also has turtles, manatees, so it was a region that drew populations to its banks even before there was agriculture in Amazonia. Now, when agriculture came upon the scene, then it became a doubly advantageous habitat, because in addition to all the riverine food resources, you had what the Brazilians call várzea. This is the land on either side of the Amazon River that floods annually and deposits a layer of silt which replenishes the fertility of the soil year after year. So that not only does it yield a lot initially, but you don't have to fallow it, since you can, the natural increase in the soil's fertility year after year makes it possible not to have to fallow it. And it was the result of this combination of factors that led populations there initially, before agriculture, increased their size and density once agriculture came in, and led to the rise of significant chiefdoms all along a good part of the upper and middle and lower Amazon. So that here, in this case, first environmental circumscription, resource concentration, and then once you've got people coming in there, when enough individuals gather and settle an area so that population becomes large and dense, then you get social circumscription. Defeated villages when warfare occurs cannot readily move elsewhere because they're surrounded by other villages on all sides. Now, a good analogy one can use here is that of boiling water. You can boil water in an open pot, but it boils much faster in a pressure cooker. In the one case, you have nothing really contains it. In the other, the water is completely contained, bounded, circumscribed by a pot, by a container, a vessel. And this is at work here too, because those areas, if you look at where in the world states arose first, it is in areas of circumscribed agricultural land. Places where it arose later, such as among the Maya, Guatemala, and southern Mexico, the Olmec in southern Mexico, West Africa, and so on, Europe, they arose, but they arose later. Because where social circumscription was at work and not environmental circumscription, it just simply took longer. The area leaked, you might say. Defeated villages had some flexibility of moving out, not as much as otherwise, and therefore it was longer before the circumscription was tight enough to produce the process that I described earlier. Okay. So, give you one more example of the difference between the two. If you look at the oldest state in Europe, using Europe a little bit broadly, it is Crete, the Minoan civilization, which was in existence by around 2000 BC. At this time, there's no state on any part of the mainland of Europe. Why? Crete was a circumscribed island. It was not so large that it couldn't be politically unified, as in the case of Sicily and Sardinia, which took much longer to unify. But at the same time, it was large enough to have a population necessary to give rise to something like a state and the organization involved in it. Now, in what I've described so far, I've mentioned the occurrence of chieftains in Peru as a stage from autonomous villages to the state. But I haven't gone into detail about the process. And I think it's important to do that now. At the bottom of the sequence, we have what are generally called simple chieftains. For example, Futuna in Polynesia, where there were only 10 villages on the island. It became politically unified into a chieftain being defined as a political unit in which there's a paramount chief that has permanent control of all the villages under him. Northern Kittiwina in the Trobriand Islands, where Malinowski did his field work, also was a simple chieftain. There were 17 villages and one paramount chief. Okay. The area where chieftains were first studied intensively was Polynesia. But it soon came to be known that there was an even better area for their study. and that was the southwestern U.S. Because here we had not only good ethnohistorical evidence of chieftains, but in addition we had good archaeological evidence. And in fact today there's more studies carried out on chieftains in the southeastern U.S. than anywhere else in the world. Well, the archaeologists who have worked there tend to divide chieftains into two types: simple chieftains and complex chieftains. Simple chieftain I've already described as just one layer above the village, with one paramount chief controlling a number of villages. Now, if the process that I've described before continues, what you have is the stronger villages conquering the weaker ones and erecting chieftains that have an additional layer. So you have the villages, then you have the districts, and then all these together form a larger chieftain. Now these larger chieftains are called complex chieftains by archaeologists in the southeast, but I prefer the term compound chieftain because that, after all, complex refers to anything above simple. So it's not a very definite term. Compound gives a better idea of how this process occurs. Namely, like in chemical compounds, you're taking atoms or molecules and compounding them into larger, more complex units. So then the southeast, there weren't very many simple chieftains left because always autonomous villages are at the mercy of chieftains, which are always stronger, and simple chieftains are at the mercy of compound chieftains, which are also larger and stronger. So that we had almost all compound chieftains in the southeast. However, there's a problem with compound chieftains. And that problem is best typified by a chieftain called Kusa, located in northern Georgia, which was one of the very largest chieftains in the southeast when the Spaniards were there in the early to mid-1500s. De Soto had visited the town of Kusa, the capital of this chieftain, around 1542, and then again in 1560 a Spanish commander named Juan Pardo again visited Kusa. And something had occurred. See, these compound chieftains are structurally weak because when they're first created, the overall paramount chief tends to retain in power the lower chieftains, because for the sake of continuity it's more convenient to keep them in office. But obviously there's a distinct weakness here. These smaller chieftains, after all, were conquered by the strong, the larger one, and they don't submit very readily, and they're always looking for a way of breaking away from the stronger chieftain. And that's exactly what happened at Kusa when Juan Pardo came by in 1560. One of the smaller chieftains had decided they weren't going to pay the tribute they were supposed to and just break away from Kusa. And Kusa was mounting a punitive expedition to bring them back in line. And Kusa asked the Spaniards whether they would like to help him do so, and they were very happy to oblige. But anyway, that points out very neatly what the structural weakness is. Now, how is this corrected? We look now at the chieftain of Powhatan in Tidewater, Virginia, which was a little later, perhaps best known to you because of John Smith and Pocahontas. Well, Powhatan was a rather extensive chieftain. It consisted of 163 villages. It was not a very old chieftain, though. It had been begun by Powhatan's father. And Powhatan's father, when chieftains arise, the paramount chief always assumes a great deal of power and begins to accumulate all the good things in life, among which, of course, are women. So Powhatan's father had quite a number of wives, which meant he had quite a number of children, Powhatan among them. And so Powhatan had, when he came to power, he had a number of brothers and half-brothers, and since he was kind of along in life when John Smith came along, he had himself a number of wives and a number of children. So he had all of these brothers and half-brothers and children, men, sons, whom he could place, he would remove the local chieftains and replace them with his own kin, individuals who could be counted on being more loyal to him than these others were. And what this did was to consolidate the structure of the chieftain. And for that reason, I've introduced the term consolidated chieftain as a stage above the compound chieftain. Well, the process from here on, that is, from how you go from a consolidated chieftain, let's say, to a state, is one that I won't really go into. It's what happens initially. These larger chieftains have a number of specialists, but there's not really such a thing as a bureaucracy. These specialists, though, can become quite numerous. For instance, a number of the African kingdoms took pride in the number of different kinds of specialists they had. For example, the king of the Baganda there was a keeper of the royal umbilical cord. And there were lots of other, what may seem to us as trivial officials, but nevertheless people removed from primary food production, differentiated from the rest of the population, and carrying out some function. Then, as kingdoms begin to evolve, they become more institutional. Instead of having individual specialists, you have institutions developing. Ancient Egypt, for instance, had Ministry of Agriculture, Ministry of War, Ministry of Commerce, and so on. This process is, as I say, this process is better understood because there's a lot more historical information about it. So it's not something that I'm going to discuss here. My job is only to kind of bring this day into existence, and then from there on, it's someone else's responsibility. Let me say one more thing. I estimate that around 1500 BC, the largest number of autonomous political units that there have ever been in the world at any one time, I think existed around that time. And they were in the neighborhood probably of 500,000. Of course, most of them consisted of autonomous villages. After that time, although autonomous villages kept increasing in number for a while because of, again, growing and splitting within each village, still the process by which they were being engulfed by large political units was taking place at a faster rate. So that over the years, from 1500 BC to the present, we've seen the process taking place almost irrevocably. The number of political units in the world has decreased and their size has increased. So that from 500,000 in 1500 BC, we now are down to 193. Now the question arises, what does this indicate? Well, it's a very decided trend. And what's the ultimate end of this trend? Well, it would be the political unification of the world. How is this to come about, if it is? Will it be by the same process that's led to the increase in the size of political units in the past, by the defeat and conquest of other smaller, weaker states? Or will it come about by some new process in which autonomous political units voluntarily give up their sovereignty in some higher interest? That's a subject for the future, and therefore not something I'm going to go into here. Let me just say, if you're interested in the future, come around tomorrow and you'll hear the future explored. Thank you.
time, if somebody would like to ask a few questions, we can spend a few minutes and take them if you'd be agreeable to that.
Sure.
Real simply, what are the differences between the chieftain, the simple one, the compound, and the other one?
Okay, a simple chieftain consists of a number of villages with one paramount chief. It's just the level of the villages and the paramount chief on top. The compound chieftain consists of a number of these units that have been welded into a large unit with an additional layer over them. The consolidated chieftain is one in which it's like the one before, except that the local chiefs are no longer the original chiefs created within those units, but rather they're imposed by the overall paramount chief.
Bill?
Did you factor in the concept of protectionism in the creation of the state?
Protectionism in what sense?
In the fact that you had a concentration of resources, which means one people had something other people want, and therefore something had to come together to protect that resource.
Well, yes. For instance, I talked about the Amazon chieftains. And the first chronicler of the first voyage down the Amazon, the Carvajal and Orellana's voyage, talks about the groups that lived on either side of the Amazon, away from the banks of the river. And the expression, every day they come down to try to dispossess those people that are living on the riverbank. So obviously, a great deal of the warfare of the chieftains once established was in protecting their territory from invaders and attackers on either side of the river.
Mary?
Yes, you know that exactly what you said. We were all tribal societies originally. So, do you have a theory that these tribal societies, now we have existing today, the tribal societies, I believe, are Africa and the Middle East. If you have a theory why those continue to become tribal societies where the rest of us have evolved in other societies?
Well, I think in the case of Africa, for example, what happened was when colonialization began, areas that consisted of a number of different tribes, very often hostile to each other, were sort of artificially clumped together by the colonial power into a state. And I don't think Europeans were too interested in welding them together into a real state, getting to erase their tribal differences. So that when decolonization took place in the 60s and so on, these tribal identities began to well up again, and old tribal animosities erupted. And I think that would be the answer I would give to your questions.
Thank you.
Yeah.
I want to know, how were these chiefs selected? Was it by might or were they chosen?
A good question. My original view was that the first chieftains resulted when the strongest single village conquered neighboring villages one by one. But I came to have questions about this, and I think it's more likely that it occurred in a somewhat different way. And this is based on my reading of the ethno-historical literature for northern South America and eastern Brazil, where warfare then was still at the autonomous village level, but it was so frequent that alliances took place. And at the time of an alliance, someone was elected as war leader. However, and under wartime conditions, he assumed really plenary powers. The power of life and death is very often characteristic, where it was not characteristic of chieftains during peace times. And that my surmise is that as this practice continued, warfare, peace, war again, and so on, the war chiefs became strong enough so that they began not to want to relinquish their power during peacetime. And the bully boys that were close to them helped them maintain themselves in power even after peace was declared. So that then it was this process rather than out-and-out conquest one by one by one by one that I think is more likely. But this issue is not definitely decided. It takes a matter of a good deal more study, but I'm inclining now to the second theory.
So what you're saying is that this process of the chiefdom and consolidated chiefdoms would have happened many times, huge numbers of times, quite a bit independent from the other instances. There might have been some copying and cultural transmission, horizontal transmission, but it seems that this process is just coming out of human beings reaching that stage of the sort of whatever intellectual stage they had reached, and then these units making them better survive within that context. And so it's kind of a convergent evolution that had happened many more times than just the major 7, 8, 10 civilizations that happened. Is that correct?
Absolutely, right. If we look all over the world, say around 1500, we see hundreds of chiefdoms all over the place. For instance, in the valley, the Cauca Valley in Colombia, for instance, when the Spaniards first moved in there in the 1530s, they found 80 different chiefdoms all up and down this valley. And Polynesia was full of chiefdoms. It's a process that I think at the base is population pressure. Before the Neolithic, human population grew extremely slowly, 1.0000 before you get the first one. Now, and I think the main thing that kept population down in pre-agricultural times, when people lived in nomadic hunting, fishing, and gathering bands, was it was very difficult for a woman to carry 2 infants with her when the band had to be moving every few days. And so infanticide was more frequently resorted to. When agriculture came on the scene, it wasn't so much that now people didn't starve to death, there was more food, because hunters and gatherers do pretty well, except in extreme conditions like the Arctic. It was more a matter of now being more or less sedentary. It was easier to raise 2 or 3 small infants, and therefore population grew at a faster rate. And it didn't. If you take a village of 100 people, if only 1 extra infant is allowed to survive in a decade, a change so small that it probably wouldn't be detected in the village itself, that gives you a 1/10 of 1% rate of increase over time. Now, it's precisely the same rate that seems to account for the change in population in the ancient Near East from about 8,000 BC to about 3,000 BC. So this population pressure creates a situation that then exacerbates warfare, directs it toward the taking of land, no longer simply to avenge warfare, to avenge witchcraft or wife stealing and so on. So, yeah, the world provides us with a very good laboratory of very many different instances of essentially the same process. Now, some archaeologists like to argue about, well, each case is very peculiar, unique. Sure, in certain aspects that's true, but there have to be certain underlying, certain common conditions because they resulted in the same phenomenon over and over again.
Lance?
Yeah. Robert, I was just surprised that you didn't mention anything about systems of communication, because I think of people like Lewis Mumford, Harold Innis, or in your own field, Jack Goody. I mean, they've put a lot of emphasis on the role of writing in providing the kind of command and control and also the underlying basis for a more homogeneous culture that would bind together larger political units. So I was wondering what you thought of that.
Well, of course, when writing does come in, it serves this function to a very marked degree. But when you look at, say, the Inca Empire,
Or the notation of Quipu.
well, there was the Quipu was a system of tallying, but it was more in the way of recording numbers of things. it wasn't really a written language. So that we can have states, and rather complex states, arising without writing. Of course, there was communication. I mean, obviously, these people talked with each other, communicated, and so on. This is more or less a given, and therefore I didn't choose to emphasize it. But it's an element there, but we can look at other elements as being more central to the basic process.
Okay. Yes, sir.
I believe you said your study was back about 10,000 years. Was there an effect of migrating populations possibly bringing some of their own structures with them? Would that have affected your study?
Well, I think the early migrations were, as I suggested, toward areas of resource concentration. Now, one thing I neglected to mention was when I first proposed the circumscription theory, resource concentration was an auxiliary hypothesis that came in later. And I applied it to principally areas like that of the old Meg and so on. But it turns out that the areas of circumscribed agricultural land were all also almost invariably areas that had this, lost my train of thought here. Yeah. Oh, yeah, that's right. The areas of circumscribed agricultural land were also areas of resource concentration. If we look at Peru, coastal Peru, for instance, the waters just off the coast of Peru were the richest fishing waters in the world.
A microphone.
The seas that touched the western shore of Peru were the richest fishing grounds in the world. And that had a great deal to do with the fact that the very earliest chiefdoms on the coast of Peru were established perhaps even in pre-agricultural times. There's some debate about this. So that here were peoples who were concentrated together because the wild food resources were there in such great numbers.
Okay, a couple more. And then we'll, yes,
I
ma'am.
assume that the chieftains throughout time were overwhelmingly men, but are there documents or records of female chieftains?
There are occasionally cases where women are reported to be chiefs, but they are rare. That's by far the exception rather than the rule.
Mm-hmm. Can you give an example of one, perhaps?
Well, let me see. How about this? Among the Dahomey in West Africa, the women were actually warriors, not just chiefs. There was an actual regiment of warrior women.
And what is the time frame of that?
Well, that's in colonial times, and since 1500 that occurred. And you get such things, for instance, in Amazonia. Among some tribes, women would go to war with the men, but not really as warriors. They would stand back of the fighting line and would retrieve arrows shot over by the enemy, give them to their menfolk to shoot back. But I should point out that among the Tupinamba of the east coast of Brazil, who were redoubtable cannibals, it was very often, when these war prisoners were taken who were later to be cannibalized, it was very often the women who were the ones most anxious to see them killed and eaten. So this idea of women having the sensitivity beyond what anything a man could experience and always kind of frowned on military activities, that is a little bit suspect.
Okay, one more over here. Yes, sir. Robert.
Are you describing patterns of adaptation in different environments and collective survival and security?
Well, yes, a lot of what I've said is precisely adaptation. Now, there's so much to the whole thing. Part of the adaptation was, again, these valleys on the coast of Peru. As population grew, warfare, as I described, took place, but also something else was happening. Systems of irrigation were being invented and applied So that instead of having a very narrow corridor on both sides of the river, now you could widen it a good deal to both sides, and therefore support a lot of population. So these dire subsistence conditions forced upon the people new technological means for enhancing their livelihood.
What were some of the characteristics, the basic characteristics of the so-called tribal chiefs? Were they mental, physical, or were they hereditary? Why did they become chiefs? There must have been a reason why they became chiefs.
That's a very good question. If we look at, for instance, in New Guinea, you hear a lot about New Guinea big men. And it's true that in more recent years, the New Guinea big man is primarily an entrepreneur. He knows how to wheel and deal economically and so on. But if you go back into the somewhat earlier literature, or very early contact times, the big man was a warrior and was a very prominent leader, and the sort of person whom you could expect to become a paramount chief. Now, New Guinea is an example of an area where I think chiefdoms were on the verge of emerging. Hadn't quite yet, but they were about to, I think. And wherever this situation occurs, these areas that I mentioned in Brazil and in northern South America, since it's warfare that creates these chiefdoms, the one best suited to lead a group in war, someone who was vigorous and intelligent and had all these marketable characteristics, was the one most likely to first impose himself as the paramount chief.
Steve, this gentleman has had his hand up a lot, so we didn't see it.
As I understand it, many tribal cultures operated so as to maintain an ecological balance in their terrain, in the place where they live. What does your theory take into account the environmental degradation that we're producing?
That we're producing, or that might have been produced millennia ago?
I'm talking about in the 20th century, and I could go back earlier than that, but the 20th century is when people began to notice it.
Well, wherever you have population growing beyond the comfortable subsistence means available to them, you're going to begin to get degradation. For instance, in Amazonia, in areas where population was getting unusually dense, one way in which you are forced to try to cope with it is by decreasing the fallow period. Customarily, you clear a plot of land, you cut down the trees, you raise manioc for 2 or 3 years, and then you have to abandon it because the fertility of the soil has gone low, and you clear another area. And you allow some 20 or 25 years before you can go back to the original plot. It takes that long for significant trees to develop and for the soil to regenerate. But if instead of having an unbounded amount of land, you're restricted to a much smaller land, then you're forced to go back to the same plot after only 6 or 8 years instead of 20 or 25 years. So, and that begins a certain degradation. It's never fully recovers fertility. It's enough so that you can get a crop from it, but not what you could have before.